Welcome to the Wildflower Learning Podcast, where we talk about everything education with leading experts in mental health fields, educational fields, parents, and kids themselves. We hope you enjoy. I really liked this episode. I felt like there was a ton of information to where editing this, I had several run-throughs, and every single time there was something new I was hearing, or something I feel like I should have known or did know, but it was put in a way that just made it so practical and simple. So in this episode, I had a chance to speak with Dr. Khan Tran. Dr. Tran has a background in philosophy and psychology. He first went to Central Florida, where he received his bachelor's, and then got his doctorate in clinical psychology at the Florida School of Professional Psychology at Argosy. After that, and I think possibly even during that time, he was also studying mindfulness, doing extensive training in the practice and applying it into his day-to-day life. All of his education gave him a foundation that to this day he works with clients, teachers, and students with that approach. All of the perspectives he holds makes him extremely knowledgeable and a compassionate person, and his demeanor is just positively contagious. If you've been in a room with him before, you'll know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. So when I interviewed Dr. Tran, there were a group of parents who were taking a workshop facilitated by him. And part of the training involved applying some of the practices at home with your children. And a few of the parents I spoke with, and I felt the same way, realized by applying these concepts, you could see a shift in your child. And some were surprising in beneficial ways. So you could see the relationship strengthen overall and a maturation with the child. And some of it did include them standing their ground when they felt like things were unfair. And so that was an adjustment of getting used to having more conversations and negotiating things rather than dominating the relationship itself. It certainly takes a lot of patience and self-awareness and letting go, which is really difficult at first, especially, and then gets easier as you keep practicing it, and you can find yourself getting in a groove that comes with benefits for the kid, but also personal benefits. It actually improves your own life and your relationship of yourself with your mind and the world around you. To put it simply, Dr. Tran's main point is to be in the present moment, noticing our inner states, our external interactions, and how these two things interplay with each other. I don't want to force anything on anyone. It would be in bad taste, especially in this episode that you're about to hear. But I hope you can take away two things. The first one I'm biased on. In my defense, this is a school podcast, but I loved his description towards the end of the episode about why he chose Wildflower for his own daughter and what the benefits are with a school like Wildflower. The other point touches on his main point in this podcast, I feel, which is being present, being mindful. If someone can truly ground themselves in the present, noticing the environment, one's own sensations, emotions, and thoughts, especially thoughts, those are slippery. There's amazing potential for self-development. We all want to be better mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, colleagues, professionals, you name it, selves. Having clarity with your own mind and how it works is a great foundation for acting in ways that you won't regret later. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Khan Tran. Okay, I'm here with Dr. Tran. This is our second episode of our Wildflower Learning Podcast. Good morning, Khan.
Good morning, and thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming in and doing this. So this podcast is actually in conjunction with a 4-week, 4-session parenting workshop on conscious parenting that Khan is doing for Wildflower. And so it's actually right after his first session he's done. So a lot of these questions will be based off of what he presented. We'll do some review of what he talked about. But there's 3 more sessions he's going to share, and I think I know a little bit about what you're going to speak on, Khan, in the next few sessions, but there's a lot of stuff I won't. Maybe in the future we could do another follow-up podcast. I'm sure there's going to be lots of different things to talk about that we don't talk about here today.
Yes, absolutely.
So, first question, what is compassion?
Not only the most, arguably, at least for me, the most important form of intelligence, perhaps next to intellectual humility, as well as gratitude. But I see it in this way, or in this form. There are 2 parts. One, the capacity to recognize that other people are suffering, and acknowledging that suffering. But what really makes it, transforms it into compassion, is part 2, which is the need and act to end others' suffering. And together, I consider that need, in terms of need, take into consideration how we respond to the others when they are suffering, which allows others who are suffering, that suffering is alleviated. So, for example, a simple act of listening with a kind of quiet focus, without the benefit of judgment or even the benefit of needing to respond in a smart way, is that space that can help alleviate that suffering, because in that space there's an acknowledgement. I see compassion as that. It is an attempt to end others' suffering through communication, through connection, through recognition.
It seems like compassion is, well, let me step back. So you talked about integrating values into your practice at one point. And it seems like the ultimate value for you is compassion. Why is that?
I've studied values and have a mental list of them. When I delved into philosophy, or psychology, there's that question, that age-old question in philosophy that you kind of explore, that goes, who am I? And with that, what follows often is when you consider who you are as a human being, or what makes your humanity, you investigate certain implicit qualities that help define you as a person. Not just that, but as a human being, we hope so much for this process of evolution. So there are certain qualities that can help facilitate that evolution, compassion being one of them. So it has great significance because of that. I'm in the business in psychology to help others, or at least put others in a position where that they can develop for themselves insight. And part of the progression in terms of personal development, what is requires the understanding of self, and self in relation to self in relation to their environment. But there should be certain gauges that are used to filter our perspective about ourselves and others, and some of those things are the qualities or values I myself practice, such as compassion or gratitude. So, to answer that question, compassion has that component that can put us in a position for potential growth and development.
You mentioned insight being extremely important for this process. What does insight feel like? It seems straightforward, but for some, many people, it can be abstract too, or something that they don't know how to do. So what would describe insight, what it feels like for you?
Insight, and I can see with a lot of my clients, they struggle with whatever ailment they come in with, and a lot of that has to do with disconnect. Or one could say insight. Insight into a lot of things about themselves they struggle with. Insight is elusive, quite elusive. It's difficult to establish. Most of us have the capacity for cultivating or developing perception. Insight itself, at least for me, has more to do with just knowledge. It's an attempt to try to understand what I'm viewing, what I notice. When I refer to as elusive, my mind's thinking all the time in analyzing and assessing certain situations, and a conclusion comes forth, results in a conclusion, but I'm not convinced all the time, if not most of the time, what I see, or what I notice, or what I concoct in my mind, which I like to consider as insight, is but an illusion. So I believe, even to this day, not sure what I see and what I establish and understand within myself is insight. So I resort to pure attention, just paying attention to what is. Just notice whatever arises, and not fall prey to what I may consider as insight or wisdom, because I'm never 100% certain.
So it sounds like it's this combination of not just knowledge intellectually, right? Because that's where the thinking mind can be at its most active state. So it's knowing all the perceptions you might have, but at the same time having a skeptical view of even that, as far as experiencing it and then extrapolating what this all means. So it's coming back to the present moment. So it's more experience-based than...
Yeah, if there is any reality that I am familiar with, it's just what I notice when I'm in that space paying attention. I can't rely on just knowledge, as you said, knowledge, and consider that as real. I'm still, even with my education at this point in my life, haven't figured out what reality is entirely.
As adults, what's the greatest thing we can do for kids?
I will go back to this over and over. Pay attention. Just to simply pay attention. We can get practical, such as spending quality time with kids, listening to kids. Those are important things, and they're practical applications of consciousness. But paying attention is important and cardinal for anyone's process of development. I think we're very inclined, at least in my experience, to want to direct our children a particular way. So we set all kinds of expectations and demands, and then we call it parenting. Parenting, I think, it's more vast and profound than that. But it does require, if anything, if you could pay attention to what's happening as it is happening, you see wondrous things about your children, your child, that they're doing all the time. I see kids as, in a lot of ways, scientists, specifically psychologists and philosopher types themselves. If you consider some of the things they ask you sometimes. I had my own child have asked me questions that you would consider in terms of philosophy, like, does God exist? What's the meaning of life? Is there a hell? So pay attention to those things. And I think you go a lot farther in terms of helping your child develop a sense of autonomy and independence in a kind of greatness, permitting them to have that space to be able to explore. That's what those questions are about. I don't answer them because I want for them to explore.
That reminds me, at the session you were doing, explaining in those moments you're having what you call peace talks, and you can expand on those, what that means, but it's a lot of what you were just describing, I think. The ratio of you speaking as opposed to the child speaking is something like 20% for you, 80% for the child, and then you pushed even harder. You said you eventually got to like 95-5, right? And then when you do speak, it's in the form of a question, or you're paraphrasing, you're kind of echoing back what the child is saying. Could you, why is that so important?
To simply put, it's not about me. I'm always wondering. As the child wonders, I wander along, and that's key. It's important because the child feels heard, and who doesn't want to feel heard? The child feels acknowledged. And besides, going back to autonomy and independence, what better way to allow the child just to be? So I listen, and I'm curious, and I want to know. The child has they can teach you a thing or two if you listen intently, purposefully. And I'm not sure if it is something that they need from me or desire from me. Those questions are philosophical questions that are intended to explore, to seek, but not to be answered. That's for them to do.
Yeah. I think it was Yuval Harari made mention that religion is about answers, spirituality is about questions, which I thought was pretty neat to think about.
And I would like for her to continue to, could you imagine when that day my daughter asked me, does God exist? Had I provided an answer, I would have stunted that curiosity. There it is. It's done. Yes, it does. God does exist. We're done. Let's move on. I want to foster the curiosity. So I feed that by asking, and my response to her was, does it? Does God exist? In return, I think that's the best thing I can offer her, is that continued sense of curiosity and questioning.
So this takes us into something you also touched on. Parents are in all of these modes at certain times. Some rely on certain aspects more than others. So what's the difference between explanation, demonstration, and emulation?
Explanation, they're all important, I think, to degrees. And we're good at the explanation part, meaning we talk a lot when we teach. Most of us do and feel that is a need. And I do that too when called for, when she is truly curious. I'll give you an example. She asked me after she asked me the question, what does God exist? She came back to me a month later and asked me again, Dad, you never answered the question, does God exist? And I returned with, what do you think I think?
And then she's ready to hit you.
Yeah. Actually, she caught me. She caught me right there. She said, you still didn't answer it. Because I'm curious about what you see is my response. So, yeah. So that's explanation. And explanation, another example, sometimes we demand respect from our children. And we may explain why respect is important. So to a certain degree, that's what I mean in terms of degree, it may be crucial for the child to understand. And demonstration is different. It's showing them. Let's say you have two kids sitting at the dinner table. One hits the other. You notice. You could go over to where the kids are, kneel down, and turn over to little Susie, for example, and say to her, can you show me how to compassionately touch your sibling, touch Junior, for example? And have her demonstrate, or you can demonstrate yourself as you run your hand down Junior's arm, for example. Little Susie sees that. You're demonstrating what compassion looks like. And emulation has to do with what you can emulate for the child. So it's living by example. So if respect is very important to you, embody that, personify that in everything you do, from the way you speak to the child, a tone of respect, for example, respect for language, respect for demeanor. So you're emulating that. You're demonstrating by example as a parent who the child looks up to. They will learn from that.
Mm-hmm. So explanation often comes from, the way you described it was a moment has arisen where a child is seeking your mind,
yes,
an explanation from you. I think often parents and adults go to explanation right off the bat. The kid isn't even wanting to interact necessarily. So it's a type of projection onto the child. What happens when well, there's two parts. You're going to say something.
And it is for that reason, that projection, that I'm concerned about if I were to respond. The issue with that is a lot of the time explanation borders coercion. And the intention is meant to be good because you, after all, experienced parent. You're the wiser one, so you want to instill all kinds of wisdom onto your child. But there's an issue. When you do things like that, a conscious parent would have to ask themselves really 3 questions. 1, what I'm about to say or share, does this have anything to do with the child or me? Yeah. And 2, how would it benefit the child in any way if it will? And we may not have answers to those questions, but it's like it's a mantra that we need to explore as conscious parents. It allows us to keep our minds open when we inquire. And then the third question is, what will this result in if I were to provide this answer? And how, and maybe fourth question, how is that congruent, or if it is congruent to the way my child learns? Does that matter? Is this information important and needed to sustain the child? I would rather question, and that's why I do so over and over, even when she came back a second, and by the way, she came back a third time. Weeks down the road, Dad, I know you still didn't answer my question. This time I really want to know the answer. And at that point, I may be inclined to ask, or I may say, why is that important to you? Which I did. I asked that. Because I want to know you, was her response. And then at that point, then I say, what do you think I am? And she said, I think you're Buddhist. Okay. Then I asked in return, what makes you think I'm Buddhist? And she said, because all the statues around the house. Yeah. I've never taught her Buddhism.
Right.
Yeah. So I have to inquire. It gets her thinking. You see that? A month down, she's still on top of that, curious as all.
Clocks are still working.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what we started with in the initial part of this conversation, the insight piece, where the realization of, my goodness, most of what's going on, I don't even know if it's true. So if I'm going to impart my wisdom that I think I have onto the child, whoa, I better make sure I'm right. And in my experience, I've had so many interactions where I thought I knew what the child needed to hear. And in a conversation, or I can't think of anything specific, but I'm blown away all the time. The simplicity that kids, there's a wisdom inside in children that just blows me away. Often they solve problems much better than I can even imagine. Just because of all of these certainties I have, because I've lived 37 years and I know all this stuff by now. Not to say, parents don't have things that children don't know, but often I find that, the kids have a better insight into what's going on, actually.
Yeah, but in part of what you just said there is so significant, because part of that curiosity for me, the constant inquiring instead of explaining or providing, has to do with, I really want to know what she knows.
Yeah.
Because there's something so magical about that time when kids are kids. I really believe in, and I listen carefully, whether it's to my own child or my client, kids, patients. If anything, because of their authenticity, their nature, as pure as it can be at that time, they are probably closer to this thing, God, than we could ever be, because of that, with that purity and the virtuosity and the humility, curiosity. I think all of that which we defined, or how religion defined or impose on us to be, whether it's be loving, grateful, understanding, it's all in a child before they're introduced religion.
Yeah. It's amazing that really seems to be the case. I think that's the neat thing about practicing mindfulness. There was a parent who mentioned it's already there. So if you come back to home base, empathy, compassion, these good traits we want in human beings, is already there when you actually come back to what you were talking about, just noticing in the moment. And I think what you had mentioned is integrating this intentional practice of compassion just puts that cultivation on steroids, right? Like it just, starts to integrate into who you are, which is really interesting. So why do you think parents have this need of control when it comes to projecting onto children and adults? I see it in myself all the time. What's behind that? Because I don't think it's always been the case. If you look at Peter Gray's work, who has consolidated a lot of anthropologist studies back in the 1800s, studying these hunter-gatherer tribes. And I, as a disclaimer, I don't want to romanticize these societies too much. I mean, there's things I enjoy now. Warm showers and, having the medical institutions and those things in place where it's amazing to be alive now. But when they studied these groups, there was very little coercion towards kids in these communities, whether it's in South America or Indonesia or Australia, Africa. There was a lot of respect for the autonomy of individuals. So what is going on in our society now where that's not the case really at all? I like Alison Gopnik's metaphor of most of society is a carpenter approach, which is we see this child and we want them to become this type of adult. So we work on them constantly, putting them in certain classes, trying to build their resume for school so they can go to a good college, constantly telling them, just as we interact with them, how they should be behaving or acting. Where does that come from?
So you notice the pressure placed on parents, though, to achieve that.
Yeah.
Look everywhere, right? The media and all, and it's important to achieve a certain status. And the pressure is great to all parents. It makes me think, and I think about this often, in terms of authenticity, what that even means. I hear people talking and using that terminology. I think there's a part of us that has been lost, or parts of us that are lost, and saddened by that, because that continues to, the confusion and the lacking is perpetuated and bequeathed to our children, and then they grow up with this false sense of self and lack of understanding, and so it deeply saddens me, and I see that when I'm sitting with my kids and adolescents, that they feel a sense of disconnect and not knowing what that disconnect is. We call it depression and anxiety, right? Because that's what it appears to be. And then it just makes sense in a lot of ways, I think, that this feeling of lost prompts us to want to do something. I think out of that there's this control, whether it's trying to control other people or ourselves in very unhealthy ways, or the things that we do in unhealthy ways. Now we've kind of replaced in some ways authenticity with the need for control. The need to thrive has diminished. It starts when you're born. All kids have that process built into them, and then we mistakenly and unwittingly strip that from them. All that is what we refer to as perseverance to at adversity. I'm just so curious about why we think that we're not aware of those things. So that's why I just pay attention, because I don't know what the truth is.
Yeah. Don't want to mess up too many things around you, right?
Yes.
Just let go so you're not interfering. In my point of view, it seems like a lot of us, and again, I include myself here, it's anxiety. It's like this ever-present anxiety, whether the pressure to be seen as a good parent, and just even just in my own life, the feeling of wanting to be in control. Because there's the false sense of safety there. Because the fact is we don't have control, really. And so for my experience, it's when I'm not being mindful or a conscious parent, I'm caught up in anxiety and fear. And I'm trying to fix it. And often, like, just based off of our conversations, I think when I notice something with my stepdaughter or daughter that I'm getting anxious or fearful about, it's often something based off of my insecurities that exist in me. And then it's coming out like I'm trying to help them, but it's not. There's nothing, I don't really need to help them with anything. It's just my bias or fears or something emerging out, and then I'm projecting onto them. And I've been on the other side of it where you are in the present and it's so much easier, right? Just to actually be there. I think it's that initial work of getting out of your mind and the anxiety that's overwhelming your awareness. Once you can get back behind that, there's like this inertia that you realize you're carrying a weight, right? You're actually doing a lot of work. And once you step back and let that go, it really seems to do multiple things for the good. I think the kids are even, right, they're absorbing that, it seems like, when you're really paying attention. And they become more at ease and, just more compassionate and want to have pro-social skills with others. So this takes us to the term conscious parenting. We've been talking a lot about it already. If you could sum it up in an elevator pitch to a parent who's wondering what it is, how would you describe conscious parenting?
I've heard it referred to as compassionate parenting as well, this form of parenting that consists of paying attention to the child, thereby creating this context for which the child can freely be, and not like me. So allowing that authenticity to develop itself without our interference. But what is required, because the definition implied conscious parenting is the parent to be conscious, to be aware of what self first and foremost, then the child, then back to self. Because you're only looking at the child as almost like a reference point to find all your foibles. So they're reflecting back to you. Yeah.
It's a mirror. They're a mirror.
Yes. At least that's what my child does to me.
Yeah,
yes.
All kids,
Yeah.
So you said something there when you were talking about the autonomy of the child, and the child is not me. What do you mean? I made my child, would be the argument back to that.
Because when you say that, that's so threatening. As if you own, right? Already you have reduced the child to an object as if you own that child. It's disturbing. Gosh, how many of us, even as adults, would like to be owned by anyone, right? I don't want to be fit into that, metaphor philosophers use as master-slave. And most relationships are that, by the way, master-slave. There's always someone who is the master, predominant, aggressive. And then you got the slave, the person who is submissive. Children tend to play that role, slave. Mm-hmm. As a slave, and I keep that in mind when I'm with a child or with people in general.
One thing that was discussed in the first session of your training with the parents was, and you're going to have to remind me of who coined this, authoritative parenting, and then you have authoritarian, permissive, and neglectful parenting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that was from Diana Baumrind. Yeah, she developed those in her experience and her studies. And she coined those styles of parenting.
Yeah. When I was at the last school I was at, we had a psychologist come, and part of his talk was getting in the sweet spot of authoritative parenting, which I'll just quickly describe as solves problems together with the child, sets clear rules and expectations, open communication, and natural consequences. So a lot of these ideas ring with me. I can get on board, but there's also parts. For me, it assumes this hierarchy of still this some set of a dominance there. So setting clear rules and expectations. That was, I think, something deep down. I had an issue with that even before I knew of conscious parenting.
Well, it makes sense if it pertains to the parent. So, yeah, set clear rules and expectations for yourself. Yes.
And the way I'm thinking of it as this is down towards the child, the child.
You are correct.
Okay.
Authoritative, style of parenting. The conscious parenting will apply all those rules, but it all pertains to the parent.
Right.
Yeah.
So the work is, it's directed at yourself.
Yeah, it's there. You're the spotlight is on you, and you have to keep it there. If you're going to evolve as a parent, expect your children to be evolved. Conscious children come from conscious parents, and being conscious means being a particular way, being empathic or compassionate or reflective.
So a pushback you'd often get from parents as far as just the first take about hearing about conscious parenting would be, in my sense, a confusion that they would see it as neglectful or permissive parenting. Not neglectful, but permissive. So just to describe that within these 4 parenting styles that we just talked about, authoritative. There's also authoritarian, neglectful, and permissive. But I think a lot of people can confuse conscious parenting with permissive parenting, which is, again, some of these things I like. Child-driven, I like that. Rarely gives or enforces rules. There's all sorts of things to talk about that. But overindulges the child to avoid conflict. That piece right there, I think, confuses a lot of things. There's other ways to approach parenting, right? You can keep the good parts of what I just said and get rid of that other piece. What would you say to that for people who say your conscious parenting you're talking about is just another form of permissive parenting?
Well, conscious parenting, I see what you're saying. It almost seems as if it's I'm being dismissive, allowing her just to do whatever she wants.
You're giving too much autonomy to the child. They need clear expectations and rules.
I wish I didn't
hear that.
I wish I didn't hear that. Now, you want a lot of autonomy for the child, but a conscious parent itself, actually, if any style of parenting, they're more involved. Because the whole notion of consciousness itself relies for the parent to pay attention. And that becomes almost your way of life and being. You're attending to the child all the time. You're with the child often, and in the context of that relationship, that's when where the child's formed. Such as what a lot of parents do, perhaps not in the right way, discipline. Conscious parents can cultivate discipline, but do so in the context of that relationship. Like discipline, for example, should be discipline for the parent, and the child will follow. It is the belief that the child is astute enough, perceptive enough, to know and to learn, and to do so, first and foremost, very young, by example, by your example. So in conscious parenting, you're not waiting for that opportunity to parent when that time comes. Every second, every moment when I'm with my daughter, I am attending. Even before coming here, she came over this morning, sat by me, and she said, "Dad, you gotta see this." I set aside my phone immediately, and I said, "Show me. What do your eyes see? What do you see? What does your mind perceive?" I see what you're saying in terms of being neglectful, in a sense, where you're not really imposing anything on the child. I do impose. I impose a lot. I impose my attention. onto her. I impose my gratitude, my compassion, my connectivity. I listen. I tell Jasmine all the time with my ears, or see, I say with my ears, and hear with my eyes, see with my eyes. I'm always paying attention, and she knows.
This touches into this next portion. I'm going to say some words. And if you could describe the misconception we have in our culture about these terms, because I do think there's a lot of unintended consequences that happen because of how we approach these different words. Expectations.
Okay, I'm a conscious teacher, so immediately my response to that would be, I take into consideration expectations that should be placed on parents. As a conscious parent, I place all kinds of expectations on me, on myself, that is. And part of that is considering what I can do to make myself a better father for my child today. And it always goes back to listen. So that's an expectation. So I think you're referring to expectation with kids, right?
Yeah.
When parents
I expect you to take out the trash. I expect you to look somebody in the eyes when you're speaking to them. I expect you to give your best academically and athletically, any, achievement.
Okay.
Driven.
All right. I'm still looking at that through the lens of consciousness. Then do what you're expecting your kids to do.
Become an all-star.
Yes, you get straight A's. You get leave your kid alone. They'll be fine.
Respect.
So what are you doing as a parent to respect your child? Again, I can't sway away from that. Please ask your child permission to enter their room before you enter their room. That would be a great way to demonstrate and teach them respect, right? So start with ourselves. Rather than respect, that's a term I've never used with my own daughter. Make sure, be respectful. Because I had to demonstrate that by example for her, what that looked like. I, however, emphasize instead compassion. I mean,
it's built in.
Yes, for that reason, it's automatic. Yes.
Tough love.
Ooh, okay, I just shivered there. Okay. Well, when I hear something like that, it falls in line with the style, the technique that would be implemented in that form, that kind of thinking, tough love, which I see associated with some form of punishment or consequence or criticism or judgment.
Or maybe stop crying, get up, you're fine.
Yeah, that's painful to hear, as I would imagine a child to hear. When the child's built for connectivity, to shut that child down that way, a phrase like that could create a lot of disconnect for the child and distort the child's reality, because the child is being told it's not okay to feel that way. Yeah. So, and to grow up with that kind of conceptualization, can you imagine becoming an adult that way? You hear sometimes adults do say that, right?
I imagine you're out of touch, right? If that's your belief, you're learning to, rather than to be with the emotion and process that, to just push it down, get over it.
So to that you said, what does that teach the child? And that these lessons are integrated, and kids identify and sometimes over-identify with parents in a way that affects them too. Growing up, get into a relationship, and relationship require emotional intelligence to be successful. You have to be able to recognize what you're feeling and what others are feeling, in order to co-regulate in a way that is meaningful and healthy.
And I imagine if you don't know how to regulate, you become dependent on other things to give you a sense of control or to kind of erase away all these emotional feelings and thoughts that keep coming back based off of historical traumas and issues. So then, we have a society who relies on drugs, alcohol, shopping, internet, those type of things.
Yeah, emotional intelligence is key in regards to being able to relate first and foremost to yourself. And so in that emotional intelligence, you get a better understanding of yourself in a different and variety of ways. How you respond to things matters. The way you connect to others, your capacity for regulating, it is just needed, and it starts with us. I think that's where we have to be examples for our children to show them what calm looks like. You ever hear parents say, calm down, right? In a tough love tone, I guess.
Kind of like screaming to children, stop yelling.
Stop
Same
yelling.
kind of thing.
Be quiet.
Yeah.
I've had teachers.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've seen that a lot.
Be quiet. I didn't get the message, but I see the face, and I'm terrified by that, right? It's no wonder why in a lot of ways, maybe this is an extreme, but I do believe a lot of that angst is projected onto us as when we were children, which what we carry is that burden of our parents' plague, suffering, struggles.
One aspect that I think was really important in your presentation on, describing conscious parenting and the different aspects was parenting with humility. What does that look like? What does that mean?
Important to that process within self, and key, like gratitude and compassion, they're up there, I think, equally a quality to instill for oneself, because it allows us to be open enough that we see our fallibilities as a parent. And it, if anything, that will extract or elicit from us our pain and suffering or fallibility is when we become a parent. It becomes apparent. So intellectual humility is a kind of intelligence that will permit for us to see where we have struggled. And the reason why that's important to parent with humility is that we can put ourselves in a position where when we discover that, we can learn from that. That's why humility in general is a very powerful practice.
We've talked about conscious parenting towards children, but one thing you mentioned is making this your daily practice, right? Integrating it into how you just are. So what does that do for your relationships with adults? So you and Viviani, when you become a conscious person, what are the benefits?
So my response to that, under the umbrella of consciousness, there are certain sure implicit qualities that constitute mindfulness or consciousness. The presence of humility and empathy and compassion and respect, sensitivity and understanding, and so on applies. So you embody that in the things that you do, whether it's relating to another human being or something as seemingly insignificant as turning on a light switch can reflect a certain attitude. One time I taught a meditation class, this was back in Evanston, and I proposed an exercise at the end of the session, and I asked them for the week until we meet next that every time they turn on a light switch, they can choose, or open a doorknob, breathe in compassion. And a gentleman in the class said, I'm not going to do that. The doorknob, focusing on the doorknob doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't help me. So my response to that was, it has nothing to do with the switch, with the doorknob. It was just about being conscious. Mm-hmm. So embodying that generalizes itself as you get better at it. Then it becomes a way of seeing, doing, being, believing. So it's just like anything. When you do an exercise, you get bigger, stronger, faster. Mindfulness practice is good for the brain. And the brain gets stronger. In the sense it starts to, because of the mindfulness practice, you become more conscious, so aware. So you can see how that way of being and living applied in relationships, like with Vivi, my wife, I can stay present to what is. Now, it's not that I don't have conflict, mm-hmm. but that conflict is not with Vivi. Mm-hmm. Any conflict with Vivi, if I trace back where that real conflict really lies, is within me. Mm.
You can use that as leverage. So Mary and I, whenever we're disputing something, and she's upset, and of course I get upset often, but I just say, this is your choice, which just makes it worse. You don't have to be mad, Mary. The intentions on my end aren't good when I'm saying that, so usually. I think sometimes it is, but...
And that's what you just said there, the intention.
Yeah.
That's what you have to ask yourself all the time. Everything that you exude and emanate, that's what I do. I often try to figure out what my intention is.
Yeah. So rather than getting a point in the argument, I should be trying to, work together and live compassion.
Come on, you don't win, really. And even if you win, you're not really winning.
Right, right.
Someone's losing.
Yeah.
And that's someone you love.
Right, yeah.
And, who in their right mind would be okay with that? Mm-hmm. So that's something I have to remind myself.
Yeah, it's so obvious, but it's funny how we can forget these things. So your daughter goes to Wildflower. Mm. This is her second year. Why have you and Viviani chosen Wildflower?
I could not believe it that this school came along. I've been searching for this for so long. I started out earlier saying, for me, I have a psychologically minded and philosophically minded way of seeing life. And because so, I know that I'm going to emanate that kind of attitude, whether I want to or not. You project things, even if you were very conscious about your projection. I had a feeling, and you're not sure, perhaps maybe also an expectation, that Jasmine will be a kind of a philosopher queen herself, a thinker. I don't know, but because Vivi and I are in the business of thinking, our kids in a lot of ways become what we are, right? Whether we want them to or not. So looking at Wildflower in the school and at what it provides, it would build on that for a while, the majority of her childhood at this point. We were cultivating that. And I was dependent on a lot of ways for others around her at this very sensitive time in her life to be able to produce that. But I understand, because it's an expectation, that not everyone are philosopher kings and queens that will help produce that. The thing with Wildflower is to provide the context that allows her, that pushes or influences the innate need to thrive in the child, emotionally, psychologically, mentally, relationally, socially, without the pressures and imposition of, my concern often is projected feelings or ideas or beliefs onto her that may not be reality-based kinds of thinking. That reality, or true reality, can only be determined by her reality in that way. So in Wildflower, it allows her to do that in the context of play. Now, the significance of play is clear in the studies, and we do in therapy with children play therapy. Now, it is a process by which a child develops a way of living. So they learn to share, for example, they learn to communicate, they learn to be self-directed. And only schools like that, whether it's Montessori or Waldorf or a Wildflower school, or schools like that, sets them in that position where they're able to further cultivate a clearer sense of identity without our interference. So the rules set by these types of schools produce that effect, that sense of independence or autonomy. And that's crucial. And why that's important to me, because where that leads as she continues to mature and grow up, the kind of maturity we expect from our children beyond expectations. And I get that effect is occurring, this maturity and growth, when, despite being sick, she wants to come to school all the time. I have to forcefully sometimes say, you can't go to school. But think about how powerful that is. It's not so much the school per se. It's the community that creates the school, the connection that she has created in that connection, meaning and purpose. What more, I think, an effect for a child to produce in a school like Wildflower that will allow her to readily find her identity without interference, where she's not going to carry the burden of expectation standards, demands, grades. She doesn't carry that. But yet, in this school, she's able to produce, and this is where I'm very impressed, insight, perception about relationships, about life. She teaches herself, and then it produces this kind of greater curiosity in abundance, where, I'll give you an example. A few months ago, several months back, Her bedtime's usually 8. I'm getting ready for bed. It was 9 at this point because at 8 I put her in bed. So I walk past her bedroom and the lights are on. She was supposed to be in bed at 8. It was 9 at this time. I knocked on the door, sign of respect. She said, "Come in." She was working on a math book that she had from a previous school she went to. She was working on it. And I asked her what she was doing. And she says, "Oh, I've decided to work on my math." Now, it's not just the math per se that was so intriguing to me, but it's what she was doing. So it fosters this, as I say, greater curiosity. And they just learn automatically. And she said, "I will continue doing this till about 11, Dad." From 8 to 11, she was self-teaching. I think when in terms of autonomy, we talk about these schools produce these kids that we know are autonomous or independent. And part of that process is they develop a curiosity that is so expansive that they want to know. And at some point, they get to it. Autodidacts, the teaching themselves. You're shaking your head.
Yeah, no, it's really the goal is what you're describing, that we're hoping for with all the kids. The last podcast we did, Ellen and I, there's different models in learning, theories of learning, and one of it is a cognitive view in which the educators would try to get the children to understand these skills and have this knowledge, to have a platform to then build more knowledge on top of. And how Wildflower does that in one respect, in the sense of what we really want for children is to learn how to learn in every aspect. So learn about themselves, learn about the culture, learn the skill sets they need to connect their passion and interest into a lifelong career or pathway in life. And so being flexible and knowing how to attain what you set your mind on is the skill that we really want every kid to have. And with that, behind that, you need to have a real sense of curiosity. So those are the aspects that we want to give every child.
You can see how with many of these kids, the identity is forming in an ideal way as far as I've assessed it. Because what often interferes as we grow up and we're trying to find our role in society, and part of that is trying to understand ourselves. Sometimes we have to remove a lot of that messy that we have incurred from our own history. Damage has been done, and then before you know it, it is only later in life that we finally establish any semblance of who we are, and then we start building on that. But by that time you're 40 years old and you realize, man, I was pretty screwed up. And here I am in search of myself. The children in these types of institutions, the schools like Wildflower, that setting is established for that right off the bat, because automatically, the motto, who am I, and what that means is discovered through the engagement and interactions that they're doing in the school.
Well, Khan, there's other questions I have for you, but we've run out of time. So we're going to have to do this again.
Okay.
For sure, if they can steal you. We are extremely lucky to have you interact with the kids and be in the space and bounce ideas off of. Both Ellen and I get to have conversations with you, which is really valuable. So thank you for your time with everything you're doing. or Wildflower.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me into space.